Thank you very much for that warm Winnipeg welcome, which is doubly appreciated on a cold January night. This is probably tropical for you, but it's absolutely freezing for me, from where I come from. Thank you to the organizers who invited me to come to Winnipeg and to speak to you on these various issues, and how fortuitous it is that you got to get a bonus topic in my being able to speak to you about today's announcement that is in the headlines everywhere. If I can just take a minute before I head into the depth of what I'm going to be speaking on tonight, and just tell you a little bit about myself. First of all, it's actually nice speaking here in the United Church. I grew up in the United Church, and I was very young. I can remember my father bringing home a book by the editor of the United Church Observer, by A.C. Forrest, who wrote a book in the late 1960s called The Unholy Land. And he had gone in the aftermath of the 1967 war to the occupied territories, and through his journalism revealed the exceptional hardship that were faced by the Palestinians initially first of all under occupation by the Israelis in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, but also the hardship faced by these newly exiled Palestinians who had fled from the West Bank in the course of the fighting to the East Bank of the Jordan for the most part, and now were not allowed to come back. His book was widely attacked for being inaccurate, for being anti-Semitic, for being hostile to Israel, and in many ways his book was against the Siegfried of the Zeitgeist of the time, in the sense that there were very few voices, very few journalists, very few analysts who were talking about the issue or the plight of the Palestinians at that point in time. And his book now, I think, has a revered position in Canadian journalism, and particularly among those who pay attention to the Middle East, for being this early warning signal of what was really going on in the Middle East. So I always feel this debt for the work of the United Church and allowing a maverick voice like that, whose voice and analysis later became mainstream. As David introduced me, I am the special rapporteur with this very long title after that. I'm one of about 55 special rapporteurs who were appointed by the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva for 6-year terms. My work and our work is unpaid, it's volunteered. I keep my day job. So in many ways, I think most of my special rapporteur colleagues are professors, and many of them are professors of law, because they work obviously in academia, which allows them the freedom, and in fact in the most cases encourages them to work, because they think obviously that having the special rapporteur on torture or the special rapporteur on food security brings a certain amount of élan to the university. Alas, not mine. When I was appointed special rapporteur in March of 2016, my university treated the appointment as an embarrassment. It refused to allow me to use the broadcast facilities, because we actually have a graduate school in broadcast, to be able to deal with a number of interviews that I wound up having. And their position was, well, your appointment has nothing to do with your academic appointment, therefore there's nothing that we wind up owing to you. So in many ways, although we preach the concept of academic freedom, and that's actually one of the areas that I study in as a labor lawyer, when it comes to facing criticism, and my appointment at the time was criticized by then Foreign Minister Stéphane Dion, the university lacked a backbone and refused to defend me against those attacks. It took actually some intrepid journalists who wound up writing about my own background, and that I in fact was well qualified for this position, but I never got that help from my university with regards to this. So what is the work that I wind up doing as special rapporteur? There are, as I said, about 55 special rapporteurs and about another 20 or 25 independent experts. Most of the special rapporteurs have thematic mandates: the special rapporteur on torture, the special rapporteur on free expression, the special rapporteur on the right of assembly, the special rapporteur on the environment, and so on. There are about a dozen of us who hold geographic mandates, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in North Korea, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, and the Palestinian territories. One of our main jobs is to write and issue 2 reports a year, one to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the other to the UN General Assembly Third Committee in New York, on themes that we choose ourselves. I'm appointed by the UN, but I'm not a UN staffer. I'm not a UN official. I'm a designated UN human rights expert, as all the other ones are as well. And I have independence and autonomy to be able to choose the topics that I'm going to write about and what I want to say with respect to them. Obviously, it's important for me to be well, let me put it this way. When I was first appointed, several of the prior special rapporteurs on the Palestinian territories got in touch with me to congratulate me. And they said to me, and as I was asking them, I had 10,000 questions to ask them about what this position was all about, and they offered me lots and lots of good advice. But the best advice at all, the one that rings in my head day after day, they said, to do your job well, you've got to keep 2 things in mind. One, you've got to be fearless. You've got to be able to say things that you're going to know are going to attract criticism, and yet say them anyways. And second, you've got to be responsible. You've got to make sure that what you say in terms of facts are as accurate as you can be. You've got to make sure that when you pronounce on an area of law, that you've got solid sources for being able to back up what you've wound up saying. And those twin responsibilities of fearlessness and responsibility have kept me ever since in trying to do as good a job as I can wind up doing. But our work actually has real-world impact. If I can cite a couple of examples. Last week, some of you may have heard the story that it appears that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia had been complicit in hacking into the cell phone of Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, the owner of Amazon, also the owner of the Washington Post. And in part because he had employed Jamal Khashoggi as a journalist who was a very critical voice with respect to the present ruling elite in Saudi Arabia. And it was 2 of my colleagues, the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Execution and the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, who issued a very detailed report that was picked up by the media all over the world and seen as being an authoritative commentary that there was medium to high confidence that his phone had been hacked by the Saudi Arabian prince in large part, because of the critical stance taken by the Washington Post towards Saudi Arabia and the state execution of Jamal Khashoggi. And last week as well, on the program CBC Ideas, they replayed some of the legal arguments made before the International Court of Justice in December with respect, or was it early January, with respect to the case brought by the Gambia in West Africa against Myanmar on the charge of genocide. And there were some very eloquent lawyers during that hour on the CBC Ideas. And each of the lawyers who spoke on behalf of Gambia with respect to the case of genocide against Myanmar, all of them quoted another one of my colleagues, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Myanmar, for some of the stellar work she had done in her reports. And if I can be immodest for a minute, some of you may have heard, and I'll try to come back to this later on, but some of you may have heard that in the end of December 20th to be precise, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court announced that she had finished her preliminary investigation with respect to complaints against Israel with regards to the potential commission of war crimes in the occupied Palestinian territory, and that she was now seeking to move her investigation to the second level, which is a formal investigation. And as part of that, she issued a 112-page report, a very detailed report, and I'm happy to say that some of my work was quoted by the prosecutor as part of her arguments that she's going to be soon making to the pretrial chamber at the International Criminal Court. One aspect of my work as Special Rapporteur is that I am not allowed to go to Israel and the occupied territories. Israel has refused my predecessors, my two predecessors, to be able to go, and they won't allow me to go as well. This is a hindrance. It would be wonderful for me to be able to go on the land, to be able to hear from people who are victims directly, and to be able to collect their stories and to be that kind of faithful eyewitness to what's going on. Instead, what I do is I go once a year for about a week or more to Amman, Jordan, and Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations come across the Jordan River and speak to me. And I'm in regular contact with them through Skype and FaceTime and other forms of communication. So I stay very much on top of this. And I have to say that my work is made somewhat easier by the fact that this probably is the best documented conflict in the world. The quality of reporting coming from Israeli and Palestinian and international human rights organizations such as Amnesty or Human Rights Watch is simply top drawer. And it makes my work, both my factual gathering and the legal analysis that I bring to my reports and to my commentary, that much easier. The same person who gave me that same predecessor of mine that gave me that great advice about being fearless and being responsible, also said that, look, this is one of the most difficult special rapporteur mandates under the Human Rights Council, but the solace to all this is that one of the greatest joys you'll have is the contacts that you make, the relationships and the friendships, and the collaboration that you have with civil society, with the Israelis and the Palestinians who advocate, who research, and who write about human rights violations. And he was absolutely true in that point as well. I'm absolutely proud of the wide range of people I wind up meeting, and the work that they provide and the advocacy that they wind up doing is absolutely indispensable to the work that I'm able to do. If I bring any sort of measure to trying to advocate for justice and equality and for respect for human rights and respect for international law, it's because of my relationships with those Israeli and Palestinian organizations. Let me turn now to the news of the day. As David had mentioned, I watched for almost an hour today of the press conference in the East Room of the White House by President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu about the peace plan that they unveiled. And I've tried in the afternoon, as much in the few minutes that I had, to try to read with respect to this. I understand that there's an 80-page peace plan with lots of detail. I've not seen it, so I don't know what the nuance of the plan was. But I have a fairly good idea, I think, from the gist of the reporting and what I heard from both Netanyahu and Trump as to the main parts of it. So if I can just go through these for a minute. What I want to make clear is at the outset is that I see no path to a durable, just peace in the Middle East based on this particular peace offering. It probably doesn't come as a surprise as any of you, but if you think of the background over the past 3 years of the Trump administration, they have moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and by doing so, recognizing undivided East and West Jerusalem as Israel's capital in defiance of international law with respect to the illegal annexation of East Jerusalem, as well as the direction by the Security Council back in 1980 that all countries that have their embassies in Jerusalem are to remove them from there and should not be moving their embassies back to Jerusalem. We know that Donald Trump also recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, over the territory it had illegally annexed in 1981. It removed, the Trump administration had ordered out and broke relations with the Palestinian Authority and ordered its delegation in Jerusalem, in Washington, to move. It cut funding, 30% of the more than $1 billion annual budget for UNRWA, the UN agency that cares for Palestinian refugees in the occupied territories and in Syria and Lebanon and in Jordan. It cut off aid as well that it had traditionally supplied to venerable Palestinian institutions, including hospitals in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And of course, perhaps most worrying, but also a signal as to where we were going, the announcement in the autumn by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that the United States would no longer recognize the Israeli settlements as being illegal. He said the new American position was that the Israeli settlements were consistent with international law. I'll come back to this with respect to international law in a little while, but this is the lead up to what we have today. And there were 5 points, I think, that I've taken. There are obviously more, I think, but these are the important ones that I think I want to convey to you, and I'm happy to discuss during the Q&A. First of all, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the United States reaffirmed that Jerusalem, undivided, is the capital of Israel, and it would recognize that as such. It would recognize the Palestinian claim with respect to wanting to have their capital in East Jerusalem. They would recognize if a Palestinian capital, it was outside the separation barrier of Jerusalem, someplace in the West Bank. And as I said before, it's sort of like saying, well, we'll recognize Winnipeg as the capital of Manitoba as long as the capital is in Selkirk. With respect to Palestinian refugees, there was virtually no mention at all with respect to them. Every December, the United Nations General Assembly, through overwhelming votes, recognizes the right of Palestinian refugees to be able to return, or have the choice of whether to return or to settle in their country of asylum, or to choose a new third country to be able to settle in. That is a basic fundamental right of all refugees anywhere in the world that was endorsed by the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees. And that was also endorsed by the Resolution 194, December 1948, by the UN General Assembly, that Palestinian refugees, those who are willing, who wish to go back to their homes and willing to live at peace with their neighbors, have the right to be able to return. This right of return of Palestinian refugees has been a central issue of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for the last 70 plus years, and it is one of the issues that was identified in the Oslo agreements in 1993, in the Declaration, and again in this Oslo II in 1995, as a core issue that was to be negotiated. This obviously, just like Jerusalem, has been taken off the table, supposedly, by the Trump administration, and their rights are now, you can languish where you are. Third, and this goes continuation of what I mentioned a few minutes ago with respect to the Pompeo doctrine, is that Israel is now going to be deemed to have sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and over all of the settlement blocks. Without having read the detail, I do take what Prime Minister Netanyahu said today, is that no Israeli homeowner is going to be uprooted, which tells me that every single one of the 240 or 45 settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are going to stay where they are, and they're going to now come under Israeli sovereignty. Annexation is absolutely illegal, absolutely prohibited under international law. That's been the way since 1945. The foundation of that is in Section 2, Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations of 1945, and it was the recognition by the international community that international borders and boundaries are to be inviolable. They're to be permanent. That one of the great causes of wars throughout the 19th and early 20th century was the willingness of states to include warcraft as a fundamental part of their foreign policy, to be able to change borders, to answer ancient grievances, to sweep in neighbors from other countries, with the ultimate culmination of the redrafting of borders by Nazi Germany in the Second World War. The UN Security Council has said on at least 8 occasions between 1967 and 2016 something to the effect of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war or force is prohibited. And all 8 of those resolutions I'm referring to are specifically resolutions with respect to Israel and its territories that it conquered in 1967. As soon as it became clear that Israel began to have expansionist and annexationist designs, which are already apparent in the fall of 1967, the United Nations made sure that they wanted embedding this principle of no annexation in the modern world in these resolutions. There are very few areas of international law which are more solidly and widely accepted as the rule against annexation. And yet that's exactly what the Trump peace plan is wound up endorsing today. The news this afternoon said that the Israeli cabinet will now meet on Sunday to be able to formally extend annexation, sovereignty, over the 30% of the West Bank, that is the settlement blocks and the Jordan Valley. The fourth point has to do with these Israeli settlements. If I said that annexation is one of the most widely accepted prohibitions in international law, tied with it for first place would be the prohibition against occupying power transferring its civilian population into an occupied territory. The one and only reason why an occupying power would transfer its civilian population into territory it now occupies is to begin the establishment of a flag of sovereignty, of a sovereign claim on that territory. And if we've forbidden countries to turn occupation into annexation, then surely we must have to do that through the forbidding of bringing in civilian settlements into the occupied territory. Israel has known since the very beginning that this was going to be illegal. Indeed, in the summer of 1967, 2 months after the Six-Day War in June, the Israeli cabinet asked Theodore Meron, who at that time was the lead lawyer in the Department of Foreign Affairs, or Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel, what was the stance in international law with respect to the settlement of civilians into occupied territory. And he wrote a memo to say this was profoundly illegal under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and the world would not accept it. His memo was read by the Israeli cabinet and discarded, and only became known 40 years later by somebody doing archival searches once those parts of the archives were opened up. He was right then. He's now 90 years old. He left Israel and went on to a very distinguished career as a law professor in New York, and then as president of the tribunal overseeing war crimes in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And he wrote an article on the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War in 2017, where he condemned Israel for having an early 20th century view and trying to maintain it into the 21st century. Settlements have been deemed to be illegal, most recently in Resolution 2334 by the Security Council in December 2016, at the very end of the Obama regime. What the Security Council said in that resolution was that Israeli settlements are a flagrant violation, their quote, of international law, and the settlement construction should be ceased, and eventually all settlements should be withdrawn. There's an old dictum in international law which says that a wrongdoer cannot have his wrongs made right by law. So it doesn't matter if the settlements were created in 1967, and just because of their duration for 50 years, suddenly they go from being an illegal settlement to having a legal status. International law doesn't work that way, but yet that's the endorsement I think has happened by today's announcement. What does that mean for the Palestinians then, the Trump announcement? It seems that the Palestinians right now have some control over 40% of the West Bank, over nothing in Jerusalem, and of course there's the divided Palestinian authorities between Hamas in Gaza and Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. It would appear that the Palestinians will get something in the range, 40 to 60% of the West Bank. But they would not be allowed to have a military. They could not sign treaties with other countries. They would have no rights over their airspace. It belongs to Israel. They would lose the Jordan Valley. They would not have an external border with any other country aside from Israel. Israel would entirely surround them. They would have, in order for a Palestinian to be able to go from north to south, would have to remain going through Israeli surveillance. To go into Jordan, they would have to go through Israeli control before being able to go there. A country that is made up now of somewhere between 50 to 60% of what the world had promised it by a genuine two-state solution, with no control over their airspace, no military, no right to sign treaties with other countries, no exclusive borders, no army. They would be allowed to have stamps. They would have a flag. They would have a seat at the United Nations. For those of you who have studied political science, that was my undergraduate before I turned to law, this is absolutely a brand new, unheard of definition of what it meaning of sovereignty and a state in the modern world of political science. And this is something that I think I know the Palestinians probably will not accept this. And from commentary I've seen by some American Jewish groups today who are critical of the deal, I happen to accept this particular analysis. The Trump plan says that this will be a 4-year hiatus period where if the Palestinians prove that they can maintain security, disarm Hamas, and otherwise keep the peace, then they'll be granted the status of having a state in this 40 to 50% of the West Bank. The Palestinians will not accept this. And what the presumption was of this one particular commentator, Michael Kroplow, who I appreciate his analysis, I've read him often. He says that if they refuse after 4 years, there will be no Palestinian state, and that will then open the door for Israel to be able to annex the rest of the West Bank. And I will come back to the idea of what, if that actually does happen, what happens to the Palestinians and their civil and political rights that are there. I'll come back and speak to that in a few minutes. Now, for those of you who follow the conflict or read about it, you might know that in the early months after the June War of 1967, there already was a debate in the Israeli cabinet about what to do with these new territories. The Israeli cabinet was open, if it could get security agreements, to wind up negotiating the return of the Sinai to Egypt and perhaps the Golan to the Syrians. And those debates wavered back and forth depending on who was in government. But there generally was no debate at all with respect to the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. Those, right from the very beginning, the Israeli cabinet, at that time the Labour government, was committed to wanting to hang on to. And what emerged in that period of time is what is called the Allon Plan, A-L-L-O-N, named after Yigal Allon, who was a minister of labor in the 1967 Israeli cabinet. And his Allon Plan, and the reason why I mention this to you, is this is the basis for what we're seeing today, 52 years later. Under his plan, Israel would retain all of Jerusalem and most of the West Bank. The Jordan Valley would be Israel's eastern border, right up to the Jordan River. They would start building settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank as a means of trying to create facts on the ground in order to be able to create a critical mass of Jewish settlers for whom no future Israeli government would have the power or the political will to try to remove in order to be able to establish a Palestinian state. As for the Palestinians, at that point in time, roughly 1 million living in the West Bank, what would happen to them under the Allon Plan was that their cities, from Jenin in the north to Ramallah to Bethlehem to Hebron in the south, would be given back to Jordan to be able to rule. Jordan refused that particular option. And the slogan was, maximum land, fewer Arabs. And so with variations, this has been, for the most part, the Israeli plan for how to deal with the West Bank in the period of time since then. If you wouldn't mind me just taking a moment to read this. In 2000, just after he was out of power, Benjamin Netanyahu wrote a book called A Durable Peace, published in 2000, 20 years ago. This is what he said then, and you tell me with respect to how that complies with what has happened today. He said, and I quote, "Israel needs 60% of the West Bank, as it requires a land buffer that includes the Jordan Valley and the hills directly overlooking it, and that would extend southward to the ridges above the Dead Sea. Israel must maintain a security cordon around Jerusalem to ensure that the city is not choked by adjoining Palestinian areas. Israel must maintain broad corridors of territory to facilitate movement from the coastline all the way to the Jordan Valley buffer in times of emergencies. These corridors, not accidentally, include much of the Jewish population in Judea and Samaria. Equally, Jordan must make sure that the main aquifer, the main water aquifer, which supplies some 40% of the country's water, running at the lower part of the western slopes of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, will not come under Palestinian control." So in 2000, he had a very direct vision of the kind of future that he saw with respect to the West Bank and the Palestinians. I think that's largely reflected in the plan that we wind up seeing today. So what is to become of the future with respect to this? If I was to talk about what the possible futures are, I often, when I give speeches, I say there are four. One choice, one option, is that there is a genuine two-state solution. And a genuine two-state solution would be recognizing a Palestinian state in all of the 22% of Mandate Palestine that was left to them beginning after 1948, with territorial continuity between Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And that Israel would have no writ, no jurisdiction. Palestine would be able to operate like a state. I think that door is closing, unfortunately. I can quote nobody better than John Kerry, the American Secretary of State, who said in 2013, when he launched his 9-month attempt to bring about a final peace arrangement between Israel and the Palestinians, he said at that time to Congress, "I think we have somewhere between 12 and 18 months left for a genuine two-state solution to be sought before the door is permanently closed." And that was 7 years ago that he said that. It's hard to believe now, with 240 settlements and 650,000 Israeli settlers throughout East Jerusalem and the West Bank, that a genuine Palestinian state with continuity in its territory and living like any other state, the right to make treaties, the right to make arrangements, the right to have borders, could possibly exist that way. So that's option number one. Option number two is where I think we're heading now, is a one-state reality where one state or one people subjugate the other. This is a one state of two-tier discrimination, segregation. Some may want to describe that as apartheid, where Israel has total control, political, legal, military, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan Valley, right up to the Jordan River. This is where we're headed to. If Israel, I think, goes ahead and annexes some of the West Bank with the option of annexing more in several years' time, the world will find it difficult, even those who hate saying that A word, that apartheid has probably arrived. Remember what the definition of apartheid is. It's two peoples living in the same geographic unit, one of whom enjoys a substantially different range of political, civil rights and legal rights than the other, with great disparities with respect to life opportunities and social living conditions. that already exists in many ways. Indeed, I've come across a number of legal scholars, including the two of my predecessors as special rapporteurs, who say that apartheid has already arrived in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The third option is what I think the Trump plan is hinting towards, is what I would call the state-and-a-half solution, where Israel, together perhaps with the United States, would find a compliant Palestinian leadership that would sign the right to have a mini-state or a Bantustan on one small part of the West Bank and call that a state. Israel would be happy to have for the stamp, the flag, the seat at the UN, and the other attributes of it to be given to that, as long as it had control over all of that area and yet no responsibility for the Palestinians who wind up living there. I doubt if there is a Palestinian leadership that would be willing to sign on that particular basis. As I won't use the word compliant, but a leadership that is as willing to try to find a genuine two-state solution, I believe, as the current Palestinian Authority leadership. It itself would never be able to find the ability to be able to sign that for a half-a-state solution. Which leads us to the fourth and final solution, because I don't see any others beyond these four. And the fourth solution, I think, would be a one-state democratic solution. A one-state democratic solution where it's one person, one vote, where it's a state for all of its citizens. This would require, obviously, a long time to want to wind up achieving. But in my view, whatever argument you want to make for whatever choice you think would wind up solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's going to have to be one that's based on internationally recognized human rights, on justice, on equality between the peoples. Remember, in terms of demography, there are somewhere between 13 and 13.5 million people living between the Jordan and the Mediterranean under Israeli rule right now. 6.5 million of them are Palestinian Arabs. Roughly 6.5 million of them are Israeli Jews. The population is a one-to-one basis. And the Palestinian population is going to wind up increasing with respect to the ratio. Now, I know that apartheid in South Africa wind up living with a 1-to-4 ratio of white to African solution. So there's nothing to say that this subjugation won't continue long into the future. But surely in terms of a world that recognizes what apartheid was, or what subjugation of one people over another was, it's going to be much more difficult for Israel to begin to justify its particular form of rule in these cases. And if I can just sort of end off with this, and then I'm happy to take questions from you. What I want to be able to say is how important international law is to the resolution, the just resolution of this conflict. International law represents the highest of achievements of our global community over the last 75 years. In a world that's rent asunder by differences in religion, in class, in ideology, in ethnicity, and race, international law and the moral values that it winds up representing, I think speaks to the very best of us. And it's the one equalizing method or mechanism that we wind up having that can wind up creating, if you like, equal rights for all, because that is what its cornerstone winds up being. Ignoring international law, and you ignore the best form of common good that we have in order to try to keep this world as safe and as prosperous and as just as possible. You wind up endorsing international law, you've got a ready-made mechanism for trying to find solutions to the most thorniest of human and national problems. And as I say in something I wrote recently, continuing to marginalize the substantive principles of international law will not bring peace to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict any closer. As a political undertaking, international law provides the baseline for negotiations by acting as the indispensable foundation for state leaders and diplomatic representatives to actually honor and enforce what they have endorsed and then discarded. As a moral vision, it has the potential to mobilize the vital energy of NGOs and civil society to articulate the principles of humanitarian protection and human rights as a persuasive campaign tool. And as legal principles, the equitable obligations of international law are, in the absence of a functioning peace process, a productive basis of politics by other means, aimed at enforcing humanitarian and human rights norms through global tribunals such as the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, domestic courts, and the forums of the United Nations. And if I can just continue with this, in the 3 years since 1917, which was the 50th anniversary of the occupation, the Israeli settlement enterprise has witnessed the greatest number of construction starts since the year 2000. The Israeli Knesset has adopted legislation both to retroactively legalize a number of unauthorized settlement outposts and to legitimize the confiscation of private Palestinian land in the West Bank for Jewish settlements. Israel consolidated its presence in Area C of the West Bank, which makes up about 60% of the West Bank, as a hinterland for permanent Jewish settlement. The Knesset became very close to enacting legislation that would formally annex several major West Bank settlement blocks to Jerusalem, and now that is actually going to happen. And the acute humanitarian crisis in Gaza, instigated by the decade-long Israeli blockade, has deteriorated the situation in Gaza even further. Even as the character of the occupation is being inextricably transformed into a formal annexation, and influential media organs such as The Guardian and the New York Times are acknowledging the final shadow last breaths of the two-state solution, the international community has continued to play diplomatic checkers while Israel has played chess. The Israeli political leadership's uninhibited willingness over the last few years to express out loud what its actions have been proclaiming for years is overturning the core assumption that the Israeli occupation is unsustainable that has guided American and international policy for the past 25 years. Prime Minister Netanyahu has stated that the most he would yield to the Palestinians is a state minus, those are his words, with all of the settlement blocks in the Jordan Valley remaining in Israeli possession. Many of his cabinet ministers have been even blunter. Here might be a good time to revisit Oslo's assumption of unsustainability, which is premised on the supposed irreducible fact that Israel has no demographic or political choice but to withdraw from all or most of the occupied territory and allow a sovereign Palestinian state to emerge if it is to preserve its Jewish character and democratic values. This working assumption that the occupation is unsustainable has been left behind by the galloping realities of the occupation. It fails to account for the creative thinking among the ascendant Israeli right that it can comfortably live with models of permanent rule over the Palestinians that would deny them citizenship and democratic rights. Second, it overlooks the striking degree of control that Israel exercises over the Palestinians as it confines them to smaller, denser, and more fragmented islands of land through its sophisticated security network of walls, checkpoints, controls over the population registry, and overwhelming military superiority. Third, this assumption overestimates the willingness of the Oslo sponsors, particularly Europe, which is Israel's largest trading partner, and the United States, Israel's diplomatic and military patron, to challenge Israel with meaningful consequences should it retreat, as it has, from any lingering commitment to a genuine two-state solution. Fourth, this assumption disregards Israel's escape clauses that has allowed Israel to pocket the cost-free features of the occupation by the large amounts of European and international aid to fund the Palestinians and the annual almost $4 billion in military aid package from the United States, while continuing to thicken its presence through the West Bank and East Jerusalem and also blockading Gaza. And fifth, it begs the question of whether a genuine two-state solution was ever possible in the absence of the international community's political will to enforce the clear obligations and prohibitions of international law that could have stemmed Israel's revanchism over the past half-century. So just let me say in conclusion this. There are areas of accountability that are many tools that the international community winds up having. Many of them have been left sleeping on the shelves of the diplomatic desks. But there are several, and I just want to point them out to you as I bring my formal talks to a conclusion. First is the International Criminal Court. This, I think, is among the most important ones. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the special prosecutor 5 weeks ago announced that she's now moving her investigation to the second formal stage of investigation into Israel, and that's covering 3 areas. It's covering the Israeli settlements, which are designated as a war crime under the Statute of Rome of 1998. It's covering Israel and Hamas's conduct during the 2014 war in Gaza. And thirdly, it's covering incidents mostly in Gaza in the period since then, including, and in particular, the shooting and killing of hundreds of Palestinian demonstrators, most of them unarmed, that began in March 2018. Second, there is the database. Almost 4 years ago, it was actually the very same time that I was appointed to become Special Rapporteur, the UN Human Rights Council endorsed a resolution directing the High Commissioner for Human Rights to create a database of Israeli and foreign companies who are involved in investment and trade with the Israeli settlements. For reasons that have never been clearly explained to me, the High Commissioner has delayed the release of that report, which was ready, I believe, probably almost 2 years ago. I have good reason to think that that report and the database is going to be released in this coming March, and it will give us, I think, a fairly accurate and detailed picture of those companies which aid the settlements. Keep in mind this. The Israeli settlements could not survive economically. They would not have the economic oxygen to be able to grow and thrive unless they were able to be kept alive by Israeli and foreign investment and banking. To its shame, when Canada adopted the revised Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement last year, it had passed regulations that said that the Israeli Customs Union, it recognizes the Israeli Customs Union as including the Israeli settlements. So, as David Kattenberg had said, on the one hand, Canada takes the express political position that the Israeli settlements are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention and are a obstacle to peace in the Middle East. On the other hand, we do not ban Israeli products coming into Canada. We, in fact, allow them to come in through the auspices of the Free Trade Agreement under tariff-free, in other words, encouraging them to come in. This is a violation. This breaches UN Resolution 465, which said that all countries must take steps to deny any kind of economic advantage to the Israeli settlements. And it also is a breach of Resolution 2334 in December 2016, which said that all countries must differentiate in their dealings between Israel and Israeli activities in the occupied territories. So these are 2 areas that keep me optimistic. If these forms of accountability can be allowed to go forward, what it may mean eventually is that Israeli leaders, both political and military, who are involved in the growth and the protection of the Israeli settlements may someday have to answer for the fact that they and their predecessors have for 50 years scorned and defied UN resolutions with respect to the Israeli settlements. If the database winds up being released and becomes an active, dynamic tool, it may mean that you and I and many, many others who are aware of the human rights violations caused by Israeli settlements may begin to identify those economic actors who assist the the settlements in becoming important components of the Israeli economy and important components of illegally seizing sovereignty for Israel in the occupied territories. Why don't I end the talk there, and I'm happy to take questions from you.